They say a man's fate on the frontier can change between one breath of wind and the next, but Silas Boone never believed that until the night he heard a child crying in the snow. The wind was howling across the Wyoming plains hard enough to rattle the loose boards of his cabin and push drifts of powder against the door like pale ghosts piling up through the dark. Silas Boone had lived alone out here for nearly 6 years, long enough to know that winter didn't forgive mistakes, and the cold had a way of turning even strong men into stories whispered around a stove. His cabin sat 12 miles from the nearest trading post, a rough timber place with a crooked chimney and a single lantern glowing faint through frost-coated glass. Most nights the only sounds were the creak of wood settling in the cold and the restless shifting of his old bay horse in the lean-to outside. That night, though, something else cut through the wind. At first Silas thought it was the storm playing tricks on him. The plains had a way of doing that, bending sound, carrying strange echoes through the darkness. But then he heard it again, thin and trembling, a sound too human to ignore. A child's voice. Silas paused with his coffee tin halfway to the stove, listening hard while the wind rattled the walls. For a moment he told himself it was nothing, just the storm. Out here a man learned to mind his own fire and let the world pass him by. But the sound came again, weaker this time, drifting through the cracks of the night like a plea the wind couldn't quite carry away. Silas set the tin down slowly. Outside, the air cut like broken glass against his face the moment he pushed open the door. Snow swirled across the yard in pale ribbons, the lantern light barely reaching past the fence posts before fading into the white darkness beyond. His breath steamed heavy in front of him as he stepped off the porch, boots sinking deep with every step. The cry came again, faint but real, somewhere beyond the frozen creek about 30 yards from the cabin. Silas pulled his coat tighter and moved toward the sound, the wind tugging at his hat brim while the snow whispered across the ground. The creek was little more than a narrow ribbon of ice this time of year, its banks hidden under wind-packed drifts that could swallow a man to the knee. Silas climbed down the slope carefully, boots crunching through the crusted snow until the lantern glow from the cabin faded behind him. That was when he saw the shape half buried beside a jagged outcrop of rock. At first it looked like nothing more than a bundle of dark cloth lost in the storm. Then it moved. A small hand shifted weakly against the snow. Silas knelt down quickly, brushing ice from the figure with gloved fingers until the pale face of a boy appeared beneath the frost. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, his hair stiff with ice and his small shoulders wrapped in thin buckskin that offered little protection against the biting wind. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but the cold had stolen most of his voice. Silas didn't ask questions. Out here the cold didn't wait for explanations. He lifted the boy carefully, surprised by how light he felt in his arms, and turned back toward the faint lantern glow of the cabin standing lonely against the storm. The boy stirred slightly as they crossed the yard, eyes barely open, his voice no louder than the whisper of snow sliding across the roof. "My father will come," he murmured, the words drifting out like a promise carried by the wind. Silas Boone pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, the wind following him in a brief swirl of snow before the heavy wood slammed shut behind him. The warmth from the small iron stove filled the room with the smell of burning pine and old smoke, a scent that had settled into every plank of the cabin over the years. Silas laid the boy gently on the rough wool blanket near the fire and knelt beside him, brushing the frozen snow from the child's shoulders. The boy barely moved except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. His buckskin clothing was stiff with ice, thin and worn in a way that told Silas the child had been out in the storm far too long. Silas reached for the kettle hanging above the stove and poured a little warm water into a tin cup, letting the steam rise slowly before bringing it to the boy's lips. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady the way a man talks to a skittish horse. The boy managed a small sip, his hands trembling as the warmth reached him. Silas took off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the child, tucking the edges tight while the fire crackled quietly beside them. Outside the storm continued to push across the plains, the wind rattling the cabin walls in long restless sighs. Inside the small room the lantern light flickered against the timber beams and cast slow-moving shadows along the floor. Silas had lived most of his life among cattle drives, dusty trails, and open skies. But these past 6 winters had been different. Out here there was no trail boss, no riders gathered around a campfire swapping stories. Only silence and the long, steady rhythm of survival. A man learned to live simply. One bed, one stove, one horse in the lean-to outside. The rest of the world stayed far away beyond the white horizon. The boy shifted slightly on the blanket, his eyes half open now, dark and watchful despite the exhaustion in his small face. Silas noticed the beaded pattern along the edge of the buckskin shirt and the thin cord around the child's neck, details that told a quiet story about where the boy came from. Silas did not ask about it. Questions could wait until morning. What mattered now was warmth and time. He placed another log into the stove, and the flames rose higher, filling the room with a deeper glow. The boy studied him for a moment, as if measuring something, then whispered again in a voice barely stronger than the wind outside. "My father will come." Silas nodded once as he adjusted the blanket around the child's shoulders. "Maybe he will," he said calmly, though he had no idea where the boy had come from or how far he had traveled through the storm. Out on the plains, distance could swallow a person whole. Miles stretched wide and empty, and a man could ride half a day without seeing another living soul. Yet something about the boy's quiet certainty lingered in the room like the echo of a promise. Silas poured another small cup of warm water and set it beside the blanket, then moved to the window for a moment. Frost covered the glass in delicate white patterns that twisted like frozen rivers across the pane. Beyond it the night stretched silent and pale under the storm clouds. No lanterns in the distance. No riders moving through the dark. Just snow drifting across the yard, and the faint shape of the old bay horse shifting under the lean-to roof. Silas turned back toward the fire. The boy had already drifted into a restless sleep, his breathing steadier now, while the warmth slowly returned to his small hands. Silas sat down in the wooden chair beside the stove and rested his elbows on his knees, watching the flames move behind the iron door. He had planned to sleep early that night, the way he usually did during winter when daylight was short and the cold made long rides impossible. Instead, he remained there, listening to the storm and the soft crackle of burning wood while the boy slept on the blanket beside the fire. Every so often Silas added another log to keep the heat strong. Hours passed quietly in that small cabin on the empty plains, and somewhere between one gust of wind and the next the storm began to ease, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred. Just before dawn the boy stirred again, his eyes opening slowly as the first faint gray light touched the frost along the window. He reached beneath the cord around his neck and pulled free a single feather, small and white with a dark tip, holding it carefully in his hand, as if it carried more meaning than words. Silas noticed the gesture, but said nothing. Out here men understood that some things were not meant to be rushed. The boy looked toward the door for a long moment, then back at Silas with quiet determination in his tired eyes. "He will come when the sun rises," the boy said softly. Morning came slowly across the Wyoming plains, not with noise, but with a quiet kind of light that crept over the frozen land inch by inch. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the world outside the cabin buried beneath a clean blanket of snow that stretched across the open prairie like untouched parchment. Silas Boone rose from his chair near the stove as the pale gray light filtered through the frost-covered window. His joints felt stiff from sitting through the long night, but he had learned long ago that sleep was not always the most important thing a man needed on the frontier. Sometimes the only thing that mattered was keeping the fire alive until morning. The boy was awake now, sitting up carefully on the blanket beside the stove. The color had returned slightly to his cheeks, and the trembling in his hands had faded, though he still looked small against the heavy coat wrapped around his shoulders. Silas placed another log into the stove, and the flames answered with a steady glow, filling the cabin with a deeper warmth that chased away the last traces of the night cold. Outside, the old bay horse snorted softly under the lean-to as the first thin rays of sunlight touched the frozen yard. The boy watched the door for a moment before turning his eyes back toward Silas. There was something calm in his gaze now, something steady that seemed older than the years written on his face. Silas poured warm water into the tin cup again and handed it to him. The boy accepted it with both hands and drank slowly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Silence in a place like this was not uncomfortable. It was simply the way things were. Finally, Silas leaned back against the wooden table and studied the child more carefully. "You got a name, son?" he asked in a quiet voice. The boy nodded once. "Nantan," he said. His voice sounded clearer now, though still soft from the cold night. Silas nodded slowly, as if storing the name away with the rest of the few things he kept in his memory. "Well, Nantan, you found yourself a mighty cold place to sleep last night." The boy looked toward the window again where the snow glowed faintly in the rising sunlight. "I had to keep moving," he said simply. Silas did not ask why. A man who had spent years riding cattle trails and winter passes knew that people often carried stories they were not ready to tell. Instead, he stepped toward the door and pushed it open just enough to glance outside. The air was sharp and still, the sky clearing into a pale blue that stretched wide over the plains. Snow drifted across the open ground in smooth curves shaped by the wind from the night before. Everything looked calm now, almost peaceful, the way the world sometimes does after surviving something harsh. Silas stepped out onto the porch and pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The sun had just begun to rise over the distant hills, casting long golden light across the frozen land. For a moment, he simply stood there breathing the cold morning air. Then something on the horizon caught his eye. At first it looked like nothing more than a faint line far across the white prairie, a ripple in the distance where the land met the sky. Silas narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly against the porch post. The shape grew clearer with every passing second. A line of movement stretching across the horizon, dark figures appearing one after another against the pale snow. Riders. Many riders. The sound reached him a moment later, distant at first, the low rhythm of horses moving across frozen ground. Silas remained still, watching the line grow longer as it advanced slowly across the plains. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly as Nantan stepped out onto the porch. The boy stood beside him, the feather still held gently between his fingers. Silas glanced down at him briefly. The child did not look surprised. If anything, he looked relieved. The line of riders continued to grow across the horizon until the shapes were impossible to mistake. Dozens of horses moving together across the snow. Then more behind them. And more still. Silas exhaled slowly through the cold air as the realization settled over him like the quiet weight of the winter sky. Whatever promise the boy had spoken during the night was about to arrive with the sunrise. Silas Boone remained standing on the porch while the riders slowly crossed the white plain, the morning sun rising higher behind them and turning the snow into a wide field of gold and silver light. At this distance, the figures looked small against the enormous Wyoming sky, yet there were far too many of them to mistake what he was seeing. The line stretched wider as it moved, spreading across the open prairie like a dark river flowing over frozen ground. Silas rested one hand against the wooden porch rail and watched carefully. Years on cattle drives had taught him to read the land the way some men read books, and what he saw now told him something important. These riders were not rushing. They were not chasing anything. Their horses moved in steady rhythm, calm and deliberate, the kind of movement that came from people who knew exactly where they were going. Behind him, the cabin door shifted softly in the cold breeze, but Silas did not turn around. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon while the shapes slowly grew larger. He could see the rise and fall of the horses now, their breath faintly visible in the cold air as the herd advanced across the open snow. Nantan stood beside him on the porch steps, the boy's small boots half buried in the powder that had drifted against the boards overnight. The child did not seem frightened. Instead, he watched the approaching riders with quiet patience, the white feather still resting between his fingers. Silas glanced down briefly and noticed the calm expression on the boy's face. That calm unsettled him more than anything else. Most children would have clung to the doorway or hidden behind the cabin wall. Nantan simply waited. The riders came closer until the low sound of hooves began to carry clearly through the morning air. It was a deep, rolling rhythm that echoed softly across the frozen plains, steady and strong like distant thunder that never quite reached the ground. Silas counted them without meaning to. 10 riders at the front, then another line behind them, then more beyond that. The number grew quickly until it was impossible to keep track. The plain that had looked empty only minutes ago was now filled with movement. Horses, riders, and long shadows stretching across the snow as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Silas straightened slightly and removed his hat, brushing a thin layer of frost from the brim before placing it back on his head. The old bay horse under the lean-to shifted nervously and stamped once against the frozen ground, sensing the approach of so many others of its kind. Silas walked down the porch steps and moved slowly toward the yard, stopping near the fence post where the snow had drifted knee-deep overnight. Nantan followed a few paces behind, still silent. The riders continued forward until their shapes became clear figures instead of distant shadows. Many of them wore dark winter blankets draped across their shoulders, the patterns catching flashes of sunlight as the horses moved. Feathers and beads swayed gently with the rhythm of the ride. The lead riders slowed first, their horses easing from a long travel stride into a measured walk as they approached the small cabin, standing alone in the snow. Silas felt the quiet weight of the moment settle across the land. The wind had almost completely faded now, leaving the prairie so still that even the soft crunch of hooves carried clearly through the cold air. A man living this far from town learned not to jump to conclusions. Still, Silas knew enough about the frontier to understand when he was outnumbered. He rested his hand loosely near his belt, not reaching for anything, simply standing the way a man does when he is ready for whatever might happen next. The riders formed a wide arc across the yard as they arrived, their horses stopping one by one in the snow until the movement across the prairie finally came to rest. What had looked like a long, distant line only minutes before was now an enormous gathering stretching across the open ground around the cabin. Silas looked across the faces of the men seated on those horses and realized that the boy had not exaggerated when he spoke of his father coming with the sunrise. The number of riders surrounding the quiet little homestead was far greater than Silas had first imagined, and for a brief moment the vast silence of the Wyoming plains seemed to hold its breath, while everyone waited for what would happen next. Silas Boone stood in the snow with the quiet patience of a man who had spent most of his life facing whatever the frontier decided to send his way. The riders had finished forming their wide circle around the small cabin, their horses standing calm despite the long ride across the frozen plains. The morning sun had climbed higher now, spreading warm light across the endless white landscape, and the snow reflected that light so brightly that the entire prairie seemed to glow. For several long seconds no one moved. The only sound was the steady breathing of horses and the faint creak of leather as the riders shifted in their saddles. Silas slowly removed his gloves and tucked them into his coat pocket. His breath drifted in pale clouds before him while he studied the men gathered in the yard. Many of them carried the calm presence of experienced riders who had traveled far across hard country. Their faces were steady and watchful, but there was no anger in their posture and no urgency in the way their horses waited. Still, Silas knew that a gathering of this size rarely happened without reason. He felt the weight of more than 200 eyes resting on the lone cowboy standing in front of the cabin. Nantan stepped forward beside him, the small boy moving carefully through the snow until he stood just ahead of Silas. The feather he had carried since dawn remained in his hand, the white plume catching the sunlight as it moved gently in the cold air. One of the riders at the front raised his hand slightly, and the entire group became even more still than before. The man who gave the signal sat tall on a dark horse with a long winter blanket draped across the saddle. His hair carried streaks of silver and black, and the quiet authority in his posture made it clear that the others were following his lead. Silas watched him carefully while the rider studied the small scene before him. The cabin, the snow, the boy standing beside the cowboy. The man's eyes rested on Nantan for a long moment, and something in his expression softened when he saw the child standing safely in the morning light. Nantan took 2 slow steps forward, leaving the porch behind and moving into the open yard where the snow lay smooth and untouched. He lifted the feather slightly so the rider could see it clearly. The man on the dark horse inhaled slowly and then exhaled in a way that seemed to release tension carried across many miles of winter land. Without speaking, he guided his horse forward a few steps. The rest of the riders remained where they were, forming a silent wall of figures stretching across the prairie behind him. Silas stayed where he stood, watching the quiet exchange unfold between the man and the boy. Nantan stopped about 10 feet from the approaching rider and looked up calmly. The man lowered his head slightly, a gesture that carried deep meaning even to someone like Silas who did not fully understand the customs of the people before him. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then the rider slid one leg over the saddle and stepped down onto the snow. His boots sank several inches into the powder, yet he did not seem to notice. His attention stayed fixed on the child standing before him. Nanton stepped closer and extended the feather. The man accepted it carefully with both hands, holding it as if it were something far more valuable than its simple appearance suggested. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the quiet yard in a calm, steady tone. "My son," he said softly. The two words seemed to ripple through the gathered riders like a quiet wind across tall grass. Silas felt the meaning settle into place in his mind. The man standing in the snow before him was the father the boy had spoken about during the long winter night. The father who had promised to come when the sun rose. The man lifted his eyes and looked directly at Silas for the first time. His gaze was strong but not hostile, and it carried the careful attention of someone measuring a stranger's character rather than judging him too quickly. The prairie remained silent around them, the riders waiting without a single impatient movement. It felt as though the entire Wyoming horizon had paused to witness whatever words would be spoken next. The man who had stepped down from the dark horse stood quietly in the snow with the feather resting in both hands, his eyes still on the boy in front of him, as if confirming that what he saw was real. The morning light stretched across the plains behind him and illuminated the long line of riders waiting in silence. Nanton looked up at him with calm certainty, the way a child does when standing beside someone he trusts. The man placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder and studied his face for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as if a question carried across miles of winter had finally been answered. Only then did he turn his attention back to the lone cowboy standing near the fence post. Silas Boone met the man's gaze without stepping back. The prairie wind had begun to move again, lifting thin ribbons of snow across the open ground between them. For a moment, the two men simply observed each other, measuring the quiet truth that often reveals more than words. The man took a few steady steps closer until he stood within speaking distance. His movements were calm and deliberate, and the riders behind him remained perfectly still, as though every one of them understood that this moment belonged to the two men standing in the snow. "You are the one who found him," the man said at last. His voice was deep and carried clearly across the quiet yard, steady as the horizon itself. Silas rested his hands loosely at his sides and nodded once. "He was out by the creek last night," Silas replied. "Storm had him near frozen." The man listened carefully, his eyes briefly returning to the boy who now stood beside him. Nanton looked up and spoke in a quiet voice that carried easily in the still air. "He brought me to the fire," the boy said. "He stayed awake all night." A faint murmur moved through the gathered riders behind them, not loud enough to disturb the silence, but strong enough to show that the words mattered. The man absorbed what he had heard without any sudden change in expression, yet something thoughtful appeared in his eyes. He studied the small cabin behind Silas, the smoke drifting slowly from the crooked chimney, the worn fence posts half buried in snow, and the single horse shifting beneath the lean-to. It was the kind of place that told a story of a man living simply and asking little from the world. Finally, the man looked back at Silas. "You did not know who he was," he said. It was not a question. Silas shook his head once. "No, sir," he answered. "Just knew he was a boy out in a bad storm." The man nodded again, slowly this time, as if weighing the meaning behind those words. He turned slightly and glanced back toward the long rows of riders waiting across the prairie. Hundreds of horses stood quietly in the snow, their riders watching with careful patience. Then the man faced Silas once more and spoke in a voice that carried clear authority. "My name is Running Wolf," he said, "and the boy you found is my son." Silas let the information settle for a moment before responding. "Then I suppose the storm carried him farther than he meant to travel," he said calmly. Running Wolf looked down at Nantan, who held his father's hand now with quiet relief. The chief lifted the feather slightly, letting the sunlight catch the white plume. "This feather tells me what happened last night," Running Wolf said. "But my son's words tell me more." He paused for a moment, studying Silas carefully again. The prairie seemed to hold its breath while the chief considered the man before him. Then Running Wolf did something that made the long line of riders shift with quiet attention. He stepped back one pace, turned slightly toward the riders behind him, and raised the feather high enough for everyone to see. A ripple of understanding moved through the gathered men like wind across tall grass. One rider after another began guiding their horses forward a few slow steps until the massive circle tightened around the small homestead. Silas watched the movement calmly, though he understood very well what it meant to be surrounded by so many riders on an empty frontier. Yet the chief's face remained calm, and there was no anger in the way the men approached. The horses stopped again only a short distance away, forming a great silent ring around the cabin and the two figures standing in the snow. Running Wolf turned back towards Silas Boone, the feather still lifted in his hand, and the quiet authority in his voice returned as he spoke again. When the sun rises after a storm, he said slowly, a man's actions are seen clearly. The wind drifted across the prairie and carried the words outward through the circle of riders, while the entire frozen landscape waited to see what would follow. The prairie remained silent after Running Wolf spoke, the words hanging in the cold air, as if even the wind had decided to listen. Silas Boone stood where he was, boots deep in the snow, his shoulders relaxed but steady, the way a man stands when he knows there is no sense pretending to be anything other than what he is. Around him the great circle of riders waited, their horses calm beneath them, the leather reins hanging loose in patient hands. The sunlight had climbed higher now, casting long shadows across the yard and turning the frost on the fence rails into tiny sparks of silver light. Nantan remained beside his father, looking between the two men with quiet confidence, as though he already knew how this moment would end. Running Wolf lowered the feather slowly until it rested again in his hand. He studied Silas Boone with the careful attention of a man used to judging character not by reputation, but by what he could see with his own eyes. Silas did not shift his stance or reach for anything. He simply waited. Finally, Running Wolf spoke again. My son walked through a night that could have taken his life, he said in a calm voice that carried easily across the snow. The wind was strong. The cold was stronger. Yet when he came to your door, you chose to help him. Silas shrugged slightly, the gesture simple and honest. Seemed like the right thing to do, he replied. The chief watched him closely for a moment longer, as if searching for any sign of pride or expectation in the cowboy's face. There was none. Silas looked like a man who had spent years living quietly with the land, someone who did what needed to be done without thinking much about how it might look to others. The riders behind Running Wolf shifted slightly in their saddles, not impatient but attentive, waiting for the chief's next words. Nantan stepped forward a little and looked up at his father. He gave me his coat, the boy said softly. He kept the fire burning until the sun came. Running Wolf nodded once, the movement slow and thoughtful. He lifted his eyes again to Silas Boone and took a few measured steps closer, stopping only a few feet away. The chief's presence carried the quiet authority of a man who had guided many people through difficult seasons. Out here, Running Wolf said, gesturing toward the endless prairie stretching beyond the cabin. A man's heart shows itself in the way he treats a stranger. Silas glanced briefly toward the riders forming the wide circle around his small homestead, then back at the chief. I suppose that goes both ways, he answered calmly. A faint hint of approval touched the chief's expression. He turned slowly and looked across the hundreds of riders waiting in the snow. They had traveled many miles to reach this lonely cabin at the edge of the plains, yet none of them had spoken or acted without his signal. After a long moment, Running Wolf raised his hand again. Not high this time, just enough for the riders to see. What happened next was so quiet that for a heartbeat Silas thought he might have imagined it. One by one the riders began to dismount. Boots touched the snow in a slow ripple that moved through the circle like a silent wave spreading outward from the chief. Hundreds of men stepped down from their horses until the entire ring of riders now stood on the ground. The horses remained calm behind them, their breath drifting softly into the cold morning air. Silas watched the movement carefully, unsure what the gesture meant, but certain it carried weight. Running Wolf faced him once more, the feather still in his hand. A man who protects a child in the night, the chief said slowly, shows respect for life. He paused, letting the meaning settle into the quiet space between them. Then Running Wolf did something that Silas Boone would remember for the rest of his days. The chief bent his knee and lowered himself into the snow in front of the lone cowboy. For a moment the world seemed to stand completely still. Then behind him, across the entire frozen prairie, every single warrior followed his example. Hundreds of men knelt in the snow at the same time, their heads lowered in silent acknowledgement while the morning sun shone over the endless white land. For a moment Silas Boone did not move at all. The sight before him stretched across the frozen prairie like something pulled from a dream rather than the rough world he knew. Hundreds of warriors knelt in the snow, their heads lowered in quiet respect, while the morning sun reflected off the white ground around them. The wind moved gently across the open plains, lifting thin ribbons of powder that drifted slowly between the kneeling men and the lone cowboy standing beside his fence. Silas had spent most of his life riding trails where respect was earned the hard way, through sweat, long miles, and quiet decisions made when no one else was watching. Yet he had never imagined seeing something like this outside his own cabin door. Running Wolf remained kneeling directly before him, the white feather still held carefully in his hand. The chief lifted his eyes and spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly through the still morning air. "My son told me what you did when the storm came," he said. "He told me you asked for nothing. Not his name, not his tribe, only that he sit by the fire and be safe." Silas shifted slightly in the snow, uncomfortable with the attention of so many people watching him. "Was just a cold night," he said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same." Running Wolf studied him with a faint expression that suggested he understood the humility in those words. "Not everyone," the chief replied. "A man alone on the plains has many reasons to close his door. Fear, suspicion, hard winters that teach him to protect only what belongs to him. But you did not close your door." The chief slowly rose to his feet again, brushing a small layer of snow from his knee before turning his gaze toward the great circle of warriors surrounding the cabin. At his movement, the men remained kneeling, waiting for his signal. Running Wolf raised the feather slightly and spoke with a voice strong enough for everyone to hear. "This man stood alone in the night and chose kindness over fear." The words rolled outward across the prairie like a quiet echo carried by the wind. Silas Boone felt a strange weight settle on his shoulders, not the kind that came from danger, but the kind that came from being seen by others in a way he had never expected. He had spent years living quietly in that small cabin, riding into town only when supplies ran low, speaking to very few people and asking even less from the world around him. Now hundreds of eyes were watching him with something that looked very much like respect. Nanton stepped closer to his father and looked up at Silas with a small smile that carried none of the exhaustion he had shown during the long night. The boy seemed proud in a quiet way that needed no explanation. Running Wolf turned back toward Silas and stepped forward again until they stood only a few feet apart. "A man's actions travel farther than the wind," the chief said slowly. "Last night your fire became the reason my son stands here today." Silas looked past the chief for a moment at the kneeling warriors stretching across the frozen land, then back to the man in front of him. "I did not know who he was," Silas said simply. "Still do not know much more than that." Running Wolf nodded once. "You knew enough," he answered. The chief then extended the feather toward Silas. "Boone." The white plume moved gently in the cold air, catching the sunlight as if it carried the brightness of the morning itself. "Among my people," Running Wolf said, "this feather is given to a man whose heart shows courage and respect for life." Silas hesitated for a brief moment, clearly unsure whether he should accept something so meaningful from a man he had only just met. The chief seemed to sense the hesitation and spoke again with calm assurance. "It is not a payment," Running Wolf said quietly. "It is a memory." Slowly Silas reached out and accepted the feather. The moment his hand closed around it, Running Wolf turned once more toward the circle of warriors and lowered his arm. At that signal the men rose together from the snow, the great silent movement spreading across the prairie like the rising of a single living tide beneath the bright Wyoming sky. The warriors rose from the snow together, the movement spreading through the great circle like a calm tide rolling across the plains. One by one they stepped back toward their horses, the quiet sound of boots pressing into fresh powder, carrying softly through the cold morning air. The sun had climbed higher now, and its light washed across the open Wyoming land with a warmth that felt almost gentle after the long winter night. Silas Boone stood still near the fence post, the white feather resting in his hand, unsure what a man was supposed to do after something like that. He had spent years living alone in that small cabin, days passing quietly between chopping wood, tending the horse, and riding the empty ridges when the weather allowed it. Out here a man usually faded into the land without anyone noticing. Yet on this morning the entire horizon seemed to have paused around him. Running Wolf turned toward the waiting horses and nodded once. The warriors moved with practiced ease, guiding their mounts forward and climbing into their saddles. The massive gathering that had surrounded the lonely homestead only minutes before began to loosen, like a storm cloud slowly drifting apart. Nantan remained beside his father, watching Silas with the open expression of a child who understood more than most people realized. The boy stepped forward through the snow until he stood close to the cowboy once again. "My father says a man who saves a life becomes part of that life forever," Nantan said softly. Silas looked down at him, the feathers still between his fingers. "You just make sure you stay out of winter storms next time," he replied with a faint smile. The boy nodded as if accepting a promise rather than a warning. Running Wolf approached once more, now standing beside his horse. He rested one hand lightly on the saddle before looking back toward the quiet cabin, the drifting chimney smoke, and the long empty plains stretching in every direction. "The land remembers what happens upon it," the chief said calmly. "So do the people who ride across it." Silas did not answer right away. He looked across the prairie where the riders had begun forming their long line once again. Hundreds of horses now stood facing the open horizon, ready to return to the distant hills they had come from. The sight reminded him just how wide the world beyond his little homestead truly was. Finally, he slipped the feather carefully into the band of his hat, where the white plume caught the sunlight. "I reckon the land will forget soon enough," he said quietly. Running Wolf studied him for a moment and shook his head slightly. "Some things are not meant to be forgotten," he replied. Nantan climbed onto his horse with the help of one of the riders and looked back one last time. The boy lifted his hand in a simple farewell. Silas raised 2 fingers from the brim of his hat in return. Then Running Wolf swung into the saddle of the dark horse and turned it toward the endless prairie. The long column of riders began to move forward at a slow, steady pace, their horses stepping carefully across the bright snow as the great gathering slowly flowed away from the small cabin. Within minutes the circle that had surrounded Silas Boone was gone, replaced once again by the wide, open silence of the Wyoming plains. The hoofbeats faded into the distance until they became nothing more than a soft echo carried away by the morning wind. Silas remained standing there for a while, watching the riders shrink into dark shapes along the far horizon. Eventually, even those shapes disappeared behind the distant hills. The prairie returned to its usual stillness. The cabin stood quiet again. The old bay horse shifted under the lean-to, and smoke curled lazily from the crooked chimney. Silas Boone turned back toward the porch, brushing the snow from his coat as he walked. Before stepping inside, he paused for a moment and touched the feather resting in his hat. The wind moved gently across the empty plains, and for the first time in many years the lonely cabin no longer felt quite as forgotten as it once had.